Glad to see you've all returned for this week's lecture. Last week we discussed why estimating is important, factors influencing estimations, and different methods used to determine estimates and costs. Today we're going to take a closer look at developing a project plan. We'll establish a link between the work breakdown structure and the project network. We'll look at diagramming a project network using activity and node methods, how to identify the critical path, and an overview framework for estimating times and costs. This week we are on Chapter 6, Developing a Project Plan. Before we dive into the details of a project network, we need to understand what one is. The project network is a tool used for planning, scheduling, and monitoring project progress. It's a graphical flowchart of the project job plan showing the project activities that must be completed, the sequences, the interdependencies of the activities, and the critical path. So then, how is a project network used? A few of the uses follow. It provides the basis for scheduling labor and equipment. It enhances the communication among project participants. It identifies activities that are critical, and it helps managers get and stay on plan. Developing the project network takes time to develop, so they are costly. However, they are deemed worthy of the cost as long as the project is not short or trivial. Project networks are developed from the work breakdown structure. As we learned earlier, work packages are the lowest level of the work breakdown structure where the activities can be found. The work packages are used to build the activities found in the project network. The activities are placed in a sequence that provides for orderly completion of the project. The figure on this slide shows a segment of the work breakdown structure example and how the information is used to develop a project network. The lowest level deliverable here is a circuit board. The cost accounts, design, production, test, and software, denote project work, organization unit responsible, and time phase projects for the work packages. In this example, the design cost account has two work packages, D-1-1 and D-1-2, specifications and documentation. We now know what a project network is and how it might be used. There's still much more to it, but before we go any further, let's take a look at some important terms. These will help us as we talk in more detail about the project network. We talked about activities, but didn't put a definition to it. In this sense, an activity is an element of the project that requires time. It takes time to complete, develop, create this portion of the project. Using this image, A, B, C, and D are all activities. Then there's merge activity. This is an activity that has two or more preceding activities on which it depends. In the image on this slide, you can see that D requires A and B to occur before D can happen. Parallel or concurrent activities can occur independently and, if desired, not at the same time. In this image, A and B are parallel activities. This example shows them being done at the same time, but they do not have to be done at the same time. Let's put our new terminology into practice. This slide shows several work packages within its network. The work packages are identified as A, B, C, D, F, and K. Some of the work packages can be done in parallel, such as B and C, while others have a finish-to-start relationship, creating a linear pattern, such is the case for D, F, and K. The activities need to be organized into a sequence. This sequence of connected, dependent activities is referred to as the network path or path. The image here shows one of the paths as being A, B, D. The critical path is the network path with the longest duration from finish to start. If an activity on the path is delayed, the project is delayed the same amount of time. An event is a point in time when an activity is started or completed. It does not consume time. In the image here, it would be the moment A starts or ends. Another event is when activity B starts. A burst event is when an activity has more than one activity immediately following it. You'll recognize it when you see more than one dependency arrow flowing from it to other activities. In this example, A is a burst activity as it has dependency arrows flowing from it to B, C, and D. We've learned what a project network is, why it's used, and the different terms used within one. Here are some basic rules to follow when developing a project network. 1. Networks typically flow from left to right. 2. An activity cannot begin until all preceding connected activities are complete. 3. Arrows indicate precedence and flow and can cross over each other. 4. Each activity must have a unique number that is greater than any of its predecessor activities. 5. Looping is not allowed. 6. Conditional statements are not allowed. 7. Use common start and stop nodes. There are two approaches used to develop a project network: activity on node and activity on arrow. An activity on node uses a node to depict an activity, while an activity on arrow uses an arrow to depict an activity. In this image, a node is each activity box. Today, the activity on node method is the most frequently used in developing project networks. Therefore, we'll be limiting our discussion to activity on node methods. To help with the development of an activity on node project network, here are some fundamentals to help you along the way. 1. Activities that must be completed immediately before an activity are called predecessor activities. 2. Activities that follow immediately after an activity are called successor activities. 3. Activities that can occur while an activity is taking place is known as a concurrent or parallel relationship. Let's put the fundamentals into practice. The top image shows A is preceded by nothing, while B is preceded by A and C is preceded by B. Conversely, A is the successor to B and B is the successor to C. In the bottom image, you can see that Y and Z are preceded by X. It also shows that Y and Z can begin at the same time, but don't need to, thus an example of a concurrent or parallel relationship. X is a burst activity. The top image shows how J, K, and L are concurrent. They can all begin at the same time, but do not need to. However, J, K, and L must be completed before M can begin. M is also an example of a merge activity, where more than one activity leads into another. The bottom image shows how activities can cross over one another. Here, activity X to activity AA crosses over the activity Y to activity Z line. Z is preceded by X and Y, and AA is preceded by X and Y. Drawing the project network puts the activities in the right sequence for determining start and finish times of activities. Performing a few simple computations allows the project manager to complete a process known as the forward and backward pass. Activity time estimates are taken from the work package duration estimates and calculated together as total time for that network node. A forward pass detects the earliest start and earliest finish times of each activity to determine the earliest that the project can be finished. A backward pass detects the latest start and the latest finish times of each activity in the network. This can be used to show how long an activity can be delayed. Here's an example of an activity on node network. In the lower right-hand corner is the legend, helping to identify what each of the cells within a node represent. We have the arrows indicating the flow. You can see that B and C are concurrent. They could start at the same time, but they don't need to. A and C are both burst activities. A is a predecessor to B and C are successors of A. And H is a merge activity. E, F, and G all feed into H. This example also shows the network with the activity time estimate found in the node. It's in the DUR cell, short for duration, so for A, the time estimate is 10 days. To calculate the forward pass, you need to remember just 3 things. 1. You add the activity times along each path in the network using early start plus duration equals early finish. 2. You carry the early finish to the next activity where it becomes the early start, unless 3. If the next succeeding activity is a merge activity, you select the largest early finish number of all its immediate predecessor activities. Let's take a look at how this works. The forward pass begins with the project start time, which is usually time 0. The early start time for the first activity, A, is 0. You can see in the legend that the ES, or early start, is in the upper left-hand corner. The early finish for activity A is 10 days. To find the early finish, we use the early start time, 0 in the case of activity A, and add the duration, 10 days in this case. This gives us 10 for the early finish. We see that activity A is the predecessor for activities B and C. Therefore, the earliest they can start is when activity A is complete, 10 days. Activities B and C then have an early start time of 10 days. Using the formula we mentioned earlier, where early finish equals early start plus duration, the early finish times for activities B and C are 15 and 35 days. Following the same process of moving along each network path provides you with the additional numbers you see in this example. Activity H is a merge activity. The early start for a merge activity depends on the early finish of all activities that merge into it. In this project, Activity H is preceded by activities E, F, and G. The earliest start time for Activity H will be the largest earliest finish between E, F, and G. In this case, Activity E has the largest finish time at 85 days. If Activity E is delayed, Activity H is delayed. The early finish for Activity H, or the project, is 100 days. The backward pass detects the latest start and the latest finish times of each activity in the network. Similar to the forward pass, you need to remember three things. 1. You subtract activity times across each path starting with the project and activity. Last finish minus duration equals latest start. 2. You carry the latest start to the next preceding activity to establish its latest finish, unless 3. If the next preceding activity is a burst activity, in which case the smallest latest finish of all preceding activities is selected. Let's look at this example of the backward pass. Begin with Activity H and a late finish of 100 days. The late start for Activity H is 85 days. Late finish is 100, the duration is 15, therefore the late start is 85. The late start for Activity H becomes the late finish for activities E, F, and G. Moving backward on the network, the late starts for E, F, and G are shown in their respective cells. The late start for Activity E is 35. The late start for Activity F is 70. And the late start for Activity G is 50. We see that Activity C is a burst activity that precedes activities E and F. The smallest late start of activities E and F is Activity E, which is 35. This determines the late finish for Activity C. The late start for Activity C becomes 10. Moving backward to the first project activity, we note it is a burst activity that links activities B and C. The late finish of Activity A is determined by Activity C, which has the smallest late start of 10 days. Given a late finish of 10 days, the late start for Activity A is time period 0. Late start equals late finish of 10 minus the duration, which is 10. Therefore, the late finish is 0. The backward pass is complete, and the late activity times are known. When the forward and backward passes are calculated, you will be able to determine which activities can be delayed by computing slack or float. Slack tells us the amount of time an activity can be delayed and not delay the project. To determine an activity slack, simply subtract the early start from the late start or the early finish from the late finish. Both will yield the same answer. Free slack is the amount of time the early finish of an activity can be delayed without affecting the early start of an immediate successor activity or activities. It usually occurs at the end of a chain of activities before a merge activity occurs. Any activity or all activities in the chain can take advantage of the free float. If there is a likelihood that the original critical path will change, it is said to be sensitive. Sensitivity suggests that once the project is initiated, one of the near critical paths could end up being an additional critical path or even the new critical path should any activity slip and cause that network path duration to increase equal to or greater than the critical path duration. Here's a completed project network with forward and backward passes completed and slack times identified. The total slack for Activity D is 15 workdays. For Activity F is 35 days, and for Activity E is 0. We know this because the late start minus early start equals slack. If total slack of one activity in a path is used, the early start for all activities that follow in the chain will be delayed and their slack reduced. After slack for each activity is computed, the critical path is easily identified. When the late finish equals the early finish for the end project activity, the critical path can be identified as those activities that also have late finish equaling early finish, or a slack of 0. The critical path is the network paths that have the least slack in common. In this example, the critical path is marked by dashed arrows, activities A, C, E, and H. A delay of any of these activities will delay the total project by the same number of days. When developing a project network, there are a few practical considerations. We'll talk about each of these in greater detail over the next group of slides. One practical consideration is network logic errors. The logic rules state that conditional statements are not permitted, and looping, or attempting to return to an earlier activity, is not acceptable. An example of a conditional statement would be, if the test is successful, build the prototype. The network is not a decision tree, so assume it will materialize. Looping defeats the project network and computation process. An activity should only occur once. If it is to occur again, the activity should have a new name and identification number and should be placed in the right sequence on the network. Here's an example of an illogical loop. If this loop were allowed to exist, the path would perpetually repeat itself. It would run from A to B to C to A to B to C in an infinite loop. Consider your activity numbering scheme when developing your network. Each activity should have its own unique identification code, usually a letter or a number. Most schemes number the activities in ascending order, that is, each succeeding activity has a larger number, so that the flow of the project activities is toward project completion. It is customary to leave gaps between numbers such as 1, 5, 10, 15, etc. Gaps allow you to add missing or new activities later. Because it is nearly impossible to draw a project network perfectly, numbering networks is frequently done after the network is complete. All of the tools and techniques discussed in this chapter can be used with computer software currently available. Here's a generic activity on node computer output. Notice that the computer outputs use numbers to identify activities. The critical path is identified by the nodes 2, 4, 6, and 9. The activity description is shown on the top line of the activity node. The activity's start time and identification are on the second line. The finish time and duration are on the third line of the node. The project starts on January 1st and is planned to finish May 20th. This example includes non-work days of holidays and weekends. This example from the book presents an early start Gantt chart. This provides an easy-to-understand, clear picture in a time-scaled horizon. This format is a two-dimensional representation of the project schedule, with activities down the rows and time across the horizontal axis. In this example, the shaded bars represent the activity durations. The extended lines from the bars represent slack. Unfortunately, when projects have many dependency relationships, the dependency lines can become overwhelming, defeating the simplicity of the Gantt chart. Consider calendar dates as you develop your project network. You will want to assign calendar dates to your project activities. If a computer program is not used, dates are manually assigned. Lay out a calendar of workdays and number them. Then, relate the calendar workdays to the workdays on your project network. You'll also want to think through multiple starts and multiple projects. Some computer programs require a common start and finish event for a project network. This is a good idea because it avoids dangler paths. Dangler paths give the impression that the project does not have a clear beginning or ending. If a project has more than one activity that can begin when the project is to start, each path is a dangler path. Danglers can be avoided by tying dangler activities to a common project start or finish node. When several projects are tied together in an organization, using a common start and end node helps to identify the total planning period for all projects. Use of dummy weight activities from the common start node allows different start dates for each project. A finish to start relationship states that the activity must be 100% completed before advancing to the next activity. If the activity has a long duration, and if that activity has a delay, that activity can be broken down into segments using laddering so that the following activity can begin sooner without delaying work. This segmenting of the larger activity gives the appearance of steps on a ladder on the network, thus the name. Here's an example of laddering from the book using pipe laying. In pipe laying, the trench must be dug, pipe laid, and the trench refilled. If the pipeline is 1 mile long, it is not necessary to dig 1 mile of trench before the laying of pipe can begin, or to lay 1 mile of pipe before refilling can begin. This image on the slide shows how these overlapping activities might appear in an activity-on-node network using a standard finish-to-start approach. In this ladder network, all activities have been broken into segments of 1/3. After a third of the trench has been dug, the pipe laying begins. After a third of the pipe laying is completed, the trench refilling begins. When a long-duration activity delays the start or finish of the next activity, the network normally breaks the activity into smaller activities to avoid the long delay of the successor activity. Using lags can avoid such delays and reduce the network detail. A lag is the minimum amount of time a dependent activity must be delayed to begin or end. They can be used to constrain the finish to start, start to finish to finish, start to finish, or combination of relationships. During this lag, no work can occur or be charged to the account code. Normally, the project manager must justify lags. The finish to start relationship represents a typical network style used in the early part of the chapter. However, there are situations in which the next activity in a sequence must be delayed even when the preceding activity is complete. For example, ordering materials may take 1 day, but it could take up to 19 days to receive the goods. The use of finish to start allows the activity duration to be only 1 day and the lag 19 days. This approach ensures the activity cost is tied to placing the order only, rather than charging the activity for 20 days of work. Here's an example of a typical start-to-start relationship. The A column shows the start-to-start relationship with 0 lag, while the B column shows the same relationship with a lag of 5 time units. The relationship may be used with or without lag. If time is assigned, it is usually shown on the dependency arrow of an activity-on-node network. You can see in the B column that activity Q cannot begin until 5 time units after activity P begins. This type of relationship typically depicts a situation in which you can perform a portion of one activity and begin the following activity before completing the first. And here we are back to the pipeline project. This figure shows the project using an activity-on-node network. The start-to-start relationship reduces network detail and project delays by using lag relationships. Essentially, each activity begins at the same time having a start-to-start relationship, but there is a delay, or a lag, between the successor activities. Digging the 1 mile trench begins. Laying pipe begins 3 days after the digging begins, or lag 3. Refilling the trench begins 3 days after the pipe laying begins, or lag 3. This slide provides examples of the finish-to-finish relationship, the start-to-finish relationship, and a combination relationship. In the finish-to-finish relationship, the finish of one activity depends on the finish of another activity. For example, testing cannot be completed any earlier than 4 days after the prototype is complete. Note that this is not a start-to-start relationship because the testing of subcomponents can begin before the prototype is completed, but 4 days of system testing is required after the prototype is finished. The start-to-finish relationship represents situations in which the finish of one activity depends on the start of another activity. For example, system documentation cannot end until 3 days after testing has started. Here, all the relevant information to complete the system documentation is produced after the 3 days of testing. In the combination of lag relationships, more than one lag relationship can be attached to an activity. These relationships are usually start-to-start and finish-to-finish combinations tied to 2 activities. For example, debugging cannot begin until 2 time units after coding has started. Coding must be finished 4 days before debugging can be finished. With the information we've just covered, we can tie in the network diagrams with lags. This is what this image represents. Older hardware depends upon the design of the system, start to start. 3 days into the design of the system, activity A, it is possible to order the required hardware, activity B. It takes 4 days after the order is placed, activity B, for the hardware to arrive so it can begin to be installed, activity C. After 2 days of installing the software system, activity D, the testing of the system can begin, activity E. System testing, activity E, can be completed 2 days after the software is installed, Activity D. Preparing system documentation, Activity F, can begin once the design is completed, Activity A, but it cannot be completed until 2 days after testing the system, Activity F. This final relationship is an example of a finish-to-finish lag. HAMOC Activities derives its name because this activity spans over a segment of a project. The HAMOC activity duration is determined after the network plan is drawn. They are frequently used to identify the use of fixed resources or costs over a segment on the project. Typical examples are inspection services, consultants, or construction management services. A HAMOC activity derives its duration from the time span between other activities. For example, a special color copy machine is needed for a segment of a trade show publication project. A HAMOC activity can be used to indicate the need for this resource and to apply costs over the segment of the project. This HAMOC is linked from the start of the first activity in the segment that uses the color copy machine to the end of the last activity that uses it. The HAMOC duration is simply the difference between the early finish for the last activity and the early start of the first activity. The duration is computed after the forward pass and thus has no influence on other activity times. HAMOC activities are useful in assigning and controlling indirect project costs. Here's an example of a HAMOC activity. The duration for the HAMOC activity is derived from the early start of Activity B and the early finish of Activity F. That is, the difference between 13 and 5, or 8 time units. The HAMOC duration will change if any early start or early finish in the chain sequence changes. In today's lecture, we talked about how a project network is developed, different types of activities within the network, determining critical path for a project, network computations, and project considerations. Please be sure to review the chapter, paying particular attention to the terms used throughout. This week you also have a case study assignment. At the end of Chapter 6, you will find the Greendale Stadium case. I would like you to complete the case as stated in the book. This involves creating a network schedule and answering the questions at the end. I would highly recommend using Microsoft Project for this case. If you do not have access to Microsoft Project, you can sign up for a free 60-day trial. I'll post a link to the trial on Blackboard under Chapter Materials. It'll be located in the Week 4 folder. If you have never used Microsoft Project, there are many tutorials on YouTube. I can help do troubleshooting from afar, but will not be able to walk you through step by step. Next week, we'll move on to discussing how to manage risks. We'll look at the different types of risks, approaches for responding to risk, and ways to identify, analyze, and assess risk. Don't forget to head over to the discussion boards and respond to this week's questions or discussions. Thank you to those who have been engaging in discussion with your classmates on the discussion boards. In addition to helping each of you, it's a way for me to learn from you as well. Have a great week.